Okay, I just finished watching Worst Roommate Ever on Netflix, but the basic idea of the series is pretty simple. What happens when the people you live with turn out to be absolutely horrible? This is the Leverton Review, where I watch and review everything I can on my way to becoming the most prolific reviewer of all time. And when I say horrible, I don't mean somebody who leaves dirty dishes in the sink or never takes out the garbage. We're talking about murderers, con artists, fraudsters, and people who basically refuse to leave your home. Netflix describes the series as stories about violent con artists and stone cold killers, and that is actually pretty accurate. And there are currently 2 seasons, so there are quite a few stories to get through. The most famous case in this series is probably Dorothea Puente, who became known as the Death House landlady. Puente ran a boarding house in Sacramento and took in vulnerable people, including people who were receiving government assistance. And eventually, investigators discovered bodies buried in the backyard. Puente was convicted of 3 murders, but investigators suspected that she may have killed many more people. But she was never convicted of the 12 murders. There were 9 additional suspected victims, but prosecutors weren't able to prove those murders beyond a reasonable doubt, so she was ultimately convicted of only 3. But who has 9 extra bodies in their yard? Crazy. She was sentenced to life in prison and died there in 2011. And there's something particularly disturbing about the way people perceived her. She looked like this harmless grandmotherly woman, and that's part of what made her so effective. One of the people featured in the documentary was Bert Montoya, who had been homeless and was dealing with mental health problems. A social worker who knew Bert actually helped arrange for him to stay at Puente's boarding house because she appeared to be a safe and caring person. Uh, she had some kittens at the time, so who could be bad with kittens? And that social worker eventually became suspicious about what was happening and played an important role in bringing attention to the situation. That's one of the things I found most interesting about this story. The person who initially thought she was helping someone find a safe place to live ultimately helped expose what was going on. She didn't look like a serial killer. There's also an interesting point made in the documentary about Puente's appearance. People kept describing her as this little old lady, but she actually wasn't some ancient woman. She was in her late 50s when the murders were uncovered, so not young, but not an elderly old woman either. So the idea that she was this helpless little grandmotherly person was largely an image that people projected onto her. And I think that's an important lesson from the whole series. We tend to make assumptions about people based on how they look. If somebody looks threatening, we're suspicious of them. If somebody looks friendly and harmless, we're more likely to trust them. But obviously, neither of those things tells you very much about what somebody is actually capable of. Let's talk about the really disturbing part of this whole story. What makes the Puente story even more disturbing is that she had already been in trouble with the law for similar crimes. She'd previously been convicted of attempting to poison a tenant and stealing from her. And she was sentenced to prison for that. After she was released, she established the boarding house where many of her victims lived, and this was in direct violation of her parole agreement. So you have somebody with a history of criminal behavior dealing with vulnerable people, and managing their money and their benefits, because she was murdering these people to get their money, basically, from Social Security. And eventually, the police began investigating what was happening at her house. The system had opportunities to intervene earlier, but it did not. Those opportunities weren't used effectively. And that's probably one of the biggest themes running through Worst Roommate Ever. It's not just, oh, how could this person be so evil? It's also, how many opportunities were there to stop them? And nobody did anything. And then there are the other roommates, but Puente is only one of the stories. The series also covers people who aren't necessarily serial killers, but are terrifying for a completely different reason. People who move into somebody else's home and then simply refuse to leave. One of the most disturbing examples is Jameson Bachman, who is essentially the nightmare version of a roommate. He repeatedly moved into other people's homes and exploited the fact that once somebody establishes residency, getting them out can be much more complicated than simply saying, okay, your lease is over, please leave. And that's something I think a lot of people don't realize. If somebody has established legal residency, you generally can't just throw their belongings onto the street, because that would be illegal. There are laws and procedures governing evictions, but there should be, but some people abuse this system. And somebody who knows how to exploit those procedures can make your life absolutely miserable. Bachman's story eventually became much more serious than simply being an annoying roommate. He had a history of conflicts with people he lived with, and his behavior eventually became violent. He also murdered his brother, Harry Bachman, in 2017 when his brother wouldn't give him a place to stay. So once again, the lesson is your roommate might be more than just a pain in the ass. They might actually be dangerous. The next story I want to talk about is Yosef Kater. Another story in the first season involves Yosef Kater. And he's a completely different kind of nightmare. He's essentially a con artist who moved between countries and identities, borrowing money and deceiving people. While living in Chile, he attacked his roommate, Kaylee Quinn, in 2011. He struck her and attempted to bury her, believing that he had killed her, but she survived, luckily. And eventually, Kater was convicted of attempted murder in Chile. He served his sentence and now he's out and about. He's one of those people where, as you're watching the documentary, you keep thinking, how did anybody believe this guy? And then you realize that's exactly how con artists work. They don't necessarily look like criminals, they look like ordinary people. They tell convincing stories. They make friends. They gain your trust. And then they exploit it. That's really what the series is about. And that's what I think Worst Roommate Ever does well. The title makes it sound like it's going to be a collection of stories about people who leave dirty dishes everywhere, or, like I said earlier, don't take out the trash, but it really isn't. It's about the fact that when you share a home with somebody, you are giving that person access to a huge part of your life. They know where you sleep. They know your routine. They know when you're home. They know when you're away. They may have access to your possessions, and most importantly, you have to trust them. And if that trust is misplaced, things can go very badly. My biggest criticism of this series is that sometimes the storytelling feels a little stretched. Some of these stories are fascinating enough that they don't really need much embellishment. You've already got police interviews, you've got the victims, you've got investigators, you've got the actual people involved telling you what happened. And personally, I think that's the strongest part of the documentary. It's really interesting to see the actual faces of the people involved, especially when you're hearing somebody describe something that happened to them years ago. Sometimes that's much more powerful than a dramatic reenactment, and I have these cartoon kind of reenactments too, which is an odd choice. And the fact that the series uses interviews with people who were actually involved gives it a sense of authenticity that I liked. So that's the lesson. So what is the lesson from Worst Roommate Ever? Well, get better roommates. That's basically it. Be careful about who you let into your home. Don't assume that somebody is safe because they look harmless. Don't assume somebody is dangerous because they look strange. I mean, do a background check at least. And if you're renting out a room or sharing a house with somebody, actually do some research. Call the references. Because the worst case scenario isn't just, oh no, my roommate ate my leftovers again. The worst case scenario is that you've invited somebody into your home who is a criminal, a con artist, or potentially a murderer. And that's what makes the series so interesting. These aren't people who broke into somebody's house. They were invited in. They were given a key. They were given a bedroom. They were given a place to live. And then the person who seemed like a normal roommate turned out to be anything but normal. So overall, I thought Worst Roommate Ever was pretty good. It's definitely worth watching if you like true crime. I'd give it like a 7 out of 10, actually. Some of these stories are truly fascinating, and the Dorothea Puente case in particular is incredible. I don't know if I'd say it's the greatest true crime documentary series I've ever seen, but it definitely kept me interested. And it certainly has made me think twice about having roommates, although at my age, I'm probably past the point where I need to worry about that, but you never know. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Worst Roommate Ever. Have you watched the series? And have you ever had a roommate who was so bad that you thought they belonged on this show? Let me know in the comments below. And I'll see you in the next review. Bye bye.